this video, we're going to give you the full story behind Mar-Vell, the original character to bear the Captain Mar-Vell title. Mar-Vell's beginnings. To start things off, what you need to know about Captain Mar-Vell is that he's a member of an alien race called the Kree. But not only that, Mar-Vell belonged to a subspecies of Kree called Pink Kree. Now, members of the Pink Kree are relatively genetically closer to humans as opposed to their counterparts, the Blue Kree. Now, as far as their race societal hierarchy goes, the Blue Kree could be very well considered as their society's number 1%ers. That is to say, there are more Pink Kree out there, but they're pretty much what you'd call the commoners of this alien race. Given that you'd think that Mar-Vell was just bound for a regular old life in outer space, but fate had other plans for him. Early on in his life, Mar-Vell would find himself enrolled in the Kree Imperial Army, one of the most elite military forces in the Marvel universe. As a result, the young Mar-Vell grew up in a Spartan society. He was separated from his parents and raised through the academy system, and all things considered, it turned out pretty well. Mar-Vell didn't just pass the test, he became a model soldier, one who was skilled and honorable enough to represent the Kree Empire. Eventually, Mar-Vell would be sent out to conduct missions for the Empire. His first adventure came when he was tasked with bringing an interstellar terror group called the Spoilers to justice. Mar-Vell would be assigned to Captain Solar's command and would end up fending off a group of creatures called Chainosaurs during their search for the Spoilers. After their battle with the Chainosaurs, Mar-Vell would come across a trio of young Flora Colossi saplings named Twig, Leaf, and Groot. Yep, it's that Groot. This caused Mar-Vell and his crew to believe that the Spoilers had come through Planet X, the home of the Flora Colossi, so they decided to head over there in hopes of intercepting and capturing their targets. Things took a turn for the worse when Captain Solar was taken out by the Chainsaws when they arrived on Planet X, and it's at this point where Mar-Vell took up the mantle of Captain Mar-Vell. You see, Kree military laws dictate that the death of a superior officer means the next officer in line should assume the position. Since Mar-Vell was that guy, well, he did his duty and took command. They'd also meet and work with Yondar, a Centurion who had initially helped them against the Chainsaws, and proceed to become an ally in their fight against the Spoilers. Captain Mar-Vell would ultimately discover that the criminals group leader was a member of the Flora Colossi race going by the name of Ags. Plus, it turns out that the Spoilers' plan was to acquire codes from the Kree Imperial Army and use them to destroy all of the worlds controlled by the Empire. And when Ags captured Mar-Vell, that's exactly what he tried to do. However, the newly appointed captain was rock solid. He didn't give Ags what he wanted. Mar-Vell proved himself to be an honorable soldier when he offered to help Ags after discovering that the Flora Colossi wasn't exactly a bad guy. It turns out that a parasite infesting his body caused this heel turn. However, Ags was in too deep. He refused Mar-Vell's help and instead threatened to put the Kree warrior out of commission. So Mar-Vell decided to confront the infected Flora Colossi with the help of the three saplings and Yondar instead. Captain Mar-Vell and his companions managed to subdue and defeat Ags and the Spoilers during a climactic battle on Planet X. They were also backed up by the Kree Star Force during this confrontation, and when all was said and done, Mar-Vell's efforts bore fruit as he and his friends saved Planet X and the Kree Empire from the Spoiler threat. In the aftermath though, Mar-Vell's superior officer in the Kree space fleet, Jan Rog, planned to basically terraform and exploit Planet X's resources, but Mar-Vell's honor would not allow it. He argued against this and ultimately convinced Jan Rog to lay off the Flora Colossi's home. As a result, Captain Mar-Vell would become a legend on Planet X, with stories about his gallantry and bravery passed on from one tree person to another for generations. The Supremer's long game. In case you didn't know yet, the Kree Empire is ruled over by an entity called the Supremer, which is part of the super advanced AI made up of collective consciousness of the Blue Kree. There's more to the Supremer than that, but that's basically the gist of the so-called ruler. Now, Mar-Vell himself would be entangled with the Supremer's plans at one point in Marvel's history when it sets its eyes on Earth. This whole deal started when the Supremer noticed that the human race had been quickly evolving, allowing them to possess superhuman powers. According to the Supremer, Earth's endemic species had the potential to attain a degree of almost limitless psionic capabilities, making them a potential threat to the Kree Empire. So the Supreme Intelligence came up with with a plan to destroy Earth. The Supremer went full Wile E. Coyote with it, as its plan involved a long, convoluted string of phases that would ultimately result in a Pink Kree and an Earthling destroying Earth with the help of their psionic powers. So where does Captain Mar-Vell fit in all this? Well, the Supremer chose him as the Pink Kree who'd be responsible for forming a psychic link with an Earthling to further its plans. In the meantime, Mar-Vell had become a bona fide Imperial hero due to his exploits as a captain in the Imperial army. Everything was going relatively well for him too. Aside from a popping career in the army, Mar-Vell even had a girlfriend named Una during this period. And remember Yon-Rogg? Well, he was one of the dark spots in Mar-Vell's life, aside from the fact that Mar-Vell's noble ideals frequently clashed with Yon-Rogg's dogmatic approach. The colonel of the space fleet also had a thing for Una, a nurse within the space fleet. Basically, he hated Mar-Vell even more than getting friend-zoned. But work is work. Mar-Vell, Yon-Rogg, and Una eventually came across an altercation between a fleet of Skrull and Shi'ar spaceships during one of their missions. Given that the Kree and the Skrull had been enemies for ages, Mar-Vell and his crew ended up helping the Shi'ar fleet. Afterwards, they met Shi'ar royalty and warrior Kelsey Naramani, aka Deathbird, who explained that her fleet was after the Brood, an alien race who had been robbing the Shi'ar of their ships. Mar-Vell and his group decided to further assist Deathbird and the Shi'ar, where they ended up fighting agents of the Brood and, long story short, emerging triumphant. It was after this adventure that the Supremer decided to spring its plan to destroy Earth. Shortly after the Shi'ar affair, Kree's Supreme Intelligence ordered for a spy ship to be sent to Earth. Mar-Vell and his crew would set foot on Earth not long after that, where he'd find himself assuming the identity of one of Dr. Walter Lawson. And this wasn't a fully fabricated identity either. You see, the real Dr. Lawson was a real human scientist working at Cape Canaveral. The doctor met his untimely end in a car accident on the way to work. Mar-Vell saw all this and realized that he and Lawson bore a resemblance to each other. So what is an alien spy without shapeshifting powers supposed to do? Assume the dead guy's identity, of course. Mar-Vell hit two birds with one stone too, because not only was he able to more easily assimilate to life on Earth, but given that the real Dr. Lawson worked in Cape Canaveral, he also was able to gather information about humanity's space travel capability at the time. He would meet a woman named Carol Danvers, the chief security at the facility, soon after, and develop feelings for her. Mar-Vell's spy efforts at the Cape were going along swimmingly until Yon-Rogg decided to throw professionalism out the window and straight up try to take out his rival. And if you haven't noticed by now, Yon-Rogg isn't exactly what you'd call an honorable man. Instead of confronting Mar-Vell himself, the space fleet colonel sicked a creature named Kree Sentry number 459 to try to take out the captain. His Looney Tunes inspired plan ultimately blew up in his face because Mar-Vell ended up destroying the Kree Sentry. Not only that, but Earth's citizens witnessed this altercation and started to laud the Kree warrior as an honest-to-goodness homegrown superhero they dubbed Captain Mar-Vell. While all this was happening on Earth, the Supremer and his underlings Zarek and Ronan the Accuser continued to proceed with their secret, ultimate plan, the destruction of Earth by way of hooking up Mar-Vell to an Earthling. During this time on Earth, Mar-Vell had grown to love the planet and its people. Little did he know that this was all part of the Supremer's master plan. Things escalated between the Colonel and the Captain when Yon-Rogg branded Mar-Vell a traitor to the Kree race after refusing a direct order. He was then sentenced to be executed on Earth, but Mar-Vell was saved when a group of marauders ambushed Yon-Rogg's men. Although this allowed Mar-Vell to escape his sentence, this whole debacle came with a price. Una was taken out during this encounter with the Akon. Afterwards, Mar-Vell literally hopped aboard a missile to send off Una's remains on an asteroid. The captain didn't account for the fact that the missile didn't have any way of transporting him back to Earth though, so he ended up being marooned in space for a couple of months, grieving. And as you'd expect, he eventually lost consciousness after drifting around on a missile with no proper accommodation or amenities. Ronan the Accuser and Zarek then retrieved the unconscious Captain Mar-Vell and subjected him to experiments. They placed the weakened Kree officer in an illusion chamber where Mar-Vell seemingly met a god named Zoe. In this illusion, Zoe gave Mar-Vell a power boost meant for him to use against Yon-Rogg, which actually resulted in him actually becoming more powerful in the real world. Now you might be wondering why Ronan and Zarek would would do this? Well, that's because the two had their own grand ambitions, to use Mar-Vell as their pawn and ultimately overthrow the Supremer. They eventually sprung their plan and tried to frame Mar-Vell for being a traitor to their race, but the Supremer caught wind of Ronan and Zarek's treachery. The two traitors were then captured but would ultimately escape. In fact, Ronan would leave a parting gift for Mar-Vell and the Supremer in the form of an antimatter explosive. It didn't work though because the Supreme Intelligence immediately disarmed it, but not before Mar-Vell showed true valiance by trying to leap on the explosive to shield the Supremer from it. In the end, and as part of the Supremer's long con, it lauded Mar-Vell and handed him a new suit along with allowing him to keep most of his newly awakened powers. But trouble just seems to be on Captain Mar-Vell's heels because right after this adventure, he'd find himself trapped inside the negative zone. Unknown to Mar-Vell, the Supremer had already arranged for him to be able to create a telepathic link with someone on Earth. This allowed the Kree warrior to not only communicate, but form a space-swapping bond with a boy named Rick Jones. His and Rick's first meeting happened when Mar-Vell psychically projected himself in front of the boy. They got to talking, and the Kree warrior eventually convinced Rick to visit an old Kree facility on Earth. There, Rick came across a pair of negabands, which Mar-Vell told him to wear. These negabands didn't exactly give Rick Jones any superpowers though. In truth, it gave him and Mar-Vell the ability to switch places whenever it's used. That means Mar-Vell got to go back to Earth whenever the negabands were used, while Rick was transported to the negative zone. So yeah, it wasn't much of a good deal for Rick. Rick's circumstances aside, neither did he or Mar-Vell know that they'd fallen right into the Supremer's grand plan. Remember, the Kree Supreme Intelligence intended to link a Pink Kree to a human being and have them ultimately destroy the world. With Mar-Vell and Rick's entanglement, the Supremer's plans grew closer to completion. In the meantime, Rick and Mar-Vell would go on a few adventures with the help of the negabands, and both men coming to the agreement to alternate their stays on Earth and the negative zone. Mar-Vell would also find himself becoming responsible for the birth of a new superhero not long after this, Miss Marvel. It all started with Yon-Rogg, being the sniveling schemer that he was, kidnapped Carol Danvers, knowing that Mar-Vell had a thing for her. So Mar-Vell rescued Carol and managed to permanently take out the evil space fleet colonel along the way. However, a wrench was thrown in this whole rescue operation when Carol inadvertently absorbed radiation from a device known as the Kree Psych Magnetron. This ultimately turned Carol's entire physiology to become altered and resemble that of a half-Kree hybrid. That is to say, she gained the fantastic abilities of a Kree warrior. From there, Carol would honor the new Kree heritage by assuming the superhero title Miss Marvel. Sometime later, Mar-Vell would finally be able to escape the negative zone with the help of the machine owned by the Fantastic Four, which meant that he and Rick no longer had to switch places from then on. More importantly, this seemingly broke their psychic link, which meant that the Supremer's ultimate plans had hit a snag. However, it would eventually manage to get its grand scheme back on track when the event known as the Kree-Skrull War broke out. During this time, Ronan the Accuser and Zarek re-emerged and successfully usurped the Imperial seat from the Supremer. They then started an all-out war against their ancient enemies, the Skrull. This saga also saw Earth's mightiest heroes, the Avengers, getting roped into this interstellar feud. In the end, the Supremer used Rick Jones to stop the war and regain its place in the Empire by granting the boy psychic powers. Then, as part of its grand plan, the Supremer forcibly removed Rick's psychic abilities, which greatly weakened the boy's body. In a bid to save Rick's life, Mar-Vell used his own life force to save the boy. This then caused the two to be psychically intertwined again, ultimately putting the Supreme Intelligence grand plan back on track. Captain Mar-Vell and Rick Jones' link to each other would only become stronger when a scientist named Benjamin Savannah subjected Rick to electromagnetic radiation. This experiment ultimately polished and stabilized Rick and Mar-Vell's link by allowing the boy to properly contain both his Kree and warrior life force inside his body. In addition to that, Benjamin's experiment also allowed Captain Mar-Vell to gain a sweet new superpower, which allowed him to convert solar energy into his own. Enter Eon. The Kree captain's next big adventure happened during Thanos' attempt at eradicating all life everywhere, and we mean the entire universe. During this time, Captain Mar-Vell met an ancient entity named Eon. Eon was originally created to simply oversee the evolution of superhumans on Earth, but it proved to be way more than that when it managed to help Mar-Vell overcome the mental conditioning he received from the Kree. That is to say, Eon helped Mar-Vell let go of his martial tendencies that were drilled into him during his academy days. As a result, Captain Mar-Vell reached inner peace. Not only that, but Eon saw that Mar-Vell is the hero that the universe needed, so he gave him another additional superpower, cosmic awareness. Now, cosmic awareness is a bit of a vague superpower in the Marvel universe, but what we can tell you is that it allows its user to pretty much become one with everything and give them the ability to feel and experience things well beyond the capabilities of the five senses. So in a way, Mar-Vell sort of got powers of a god. In addition to that, Eon dubbed Mar-Vell as the protector of the universe, after which he became instrumental in foiling Thanos' plans of erasing life in the universe. After meeting Eon and fighting against Thanos, Mar-Vell would come across a man named Robert Hunter, aka the supervillain Nitro. Little did Captain Marvel know that this particular encounter would be the spark that would eventually bring his demise. You see, Nitro had successfully stolen a chemical agent called Compound 13 before he and the Captain came face to face. Mar-Vell and Rick Jones would defeat Nitro with relative ease, but their ensuing fight caused the canister containing Compound 13 to puncture. Captain Marvel was successful at plugging the leak and saving the world from a deadly chemical gas, but he didn't notice when he accidentally inhaled a bit of the nerve agent while stopping the leak. Mar-Vell got knocked out from the fumes but seemingly recovered right after. Unknown to him, Compound 13 was able to ravage his body from within, and the Kree warrior wouldn't notice it for a long time. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Soon after the fight with Nitro, both Rick Jones and Mar-Vell would find out that they could maximize their powers in battle by fully merging with each other, and this is where the Supremer's ultimate plan finally reaches its final stages. You see, the Supremer was planning on having Rick and Mar-Vell merge, after which it would challenge the two to a fight and defeat them. In doing so, the Supremer would activate the so-called Millennia Bloom to take control of both Rick and Mar-Vell's minds and ultimately use them to lay waste to Earth. But the Kree's supreme intelligence experienced the hardest of disappointments when Rick Jones managed to foil its attempts. He did this by starting a solar flare, forcing the Supremer to use up all its resources and energy in protecting itself and its constituents instead of, setting its eyes on Rick and Mar-Vell. Afterwards, Mar-Vell and Rick's link to each other would be fully broken when the Kree warrior tricked the villain called the Super Adaptoid to basically switch places with Rick in the negative zone. This ultimately allowed Mar-Vell and the boy to live their lives independent of one another on Earth. Captain Marvel's demise. Based on the Marvel original graphic novel of the same name, we find out the consequences that came from Mar-Vell's fateful encounter with Nitro. Remember the Compound 13 he inhaled while trying to stop its canister from leaking? Yeah, it did a number on Mar-Vell's body and gave him a terminal illness. In his final days, we find out that the only thing that had been keeping Mar-Vell alive was his negabands. If he removed them, he'd succumb to his disease in a matter of hours. However, the negabands were also the same thing preventing him from being treated. Getting help from the Kree Empire was also off the table at this point, since he was branded a traitor after foiling the Supreme Intelligence's plans to destroy Earth. What transpired then was one of the most beautiful send-offs, as Mr. Fantastic and Hank tried their best to find a cure for Mar-Vell, but to no avail. In the end, Mar-Vell confronted his own mortality. There was no grand battle in the middle of Times Square, no heroic sacrifice by way of flying into the sun. There was only a Kree warrior in his bed surrounded by his closest friends and loved ones. Mar-Vell would succumb to his disease and would forever be remembered as one of the greatest heroes in the Marvel universe. And for the most part, Captain Marvel is one of those rare characters who remained in the great beyond after his initial demise. Well, relatively speaking, of course, because Captain Marvel's story doesn't quite end here. The unexpected mantle bearer. Years later, the Skrulls would plan their secret invasion of Earth. During this storyline, a Skrull agent named Karn was subjected to a procedure in which he found himself permanently shapeshifting into the form of the late Mar-Vell. Karn's fellow Skrull agents put implants in his brain containing Mar-Vell's memories, and well, it worked out as you'd expect. Karn started to think he was the real Captain Marvel. In reality, the Skrulls were planning on using Karn as a sleeper agent who would then awaken as an agent of their empire when the time was right for their secret invasion. This went out of the window, however, when Karn actually believed he was the real Mar-Vell. But in the end, Karn was able to realize that he was a Skrull. He then started to attack the Thunderbolts' home base right after that, and only was stopped after Norman Osborn, of all people, convinced him. Karn then crashed his ship just as he left the scene. Afterwards, the Kree warrior, Novar, found him in the wreckage. He knew that his end was near, and in one last valiant act, he betrayed the Skrull Empire and asked Novar to take the mantle of Captain Marvel and continue his fight against them. Captain Marvel's brief, return. Captain Mar-Vell would briefly make a true comeback during the Chaos War storyline. In it, the late Kree warrior was resurrected when the veil between life and death became weakened, and he didn't return as a mindless zombie either. In fact, Mar-Vell immediately went back to his heroic roots and helped Earth's mightiest heroes face off against the likes of the Grim Reaper, Necra, and Amatsu Mikaboshi. However, he would soon go back to the land of the dead when the Grim Reaper himself got hold of Mar-Vell and promptly sent him back to the afterlife. Sometime later, Mar-Vell would find himself in the land of the living when Minister Mar-Vell and his son employed the Kree's Macan crystal. This brought the late captain back to life, and we soon find out that the Minister Mar-Vell and his kid did this in order to protect the Empire from the Phoenix Force and clear their family's name. Remember, Mar-Vell died as a traitor to the Kree after uncovering and foiling the Supremers' plan, which prompted his living descendants to do this. During the second resurrection, Mar-Vell started off as a husk of himself. He had no memory of his old life and was pretty much a pawn in the Kree's plans. However, his old friend and fellow superhero Vision successfully freed Mar-Vell and allowed his memories to return. Just like before though, this stint as a bona fide living superhero would prove to be another short one for Captain Mar-Vell, because soon after receiving his memories and consciousness, Mar-Vell would face the godlike Phoenix Force. You see, the Phoenix had been hunting down parts of itself during this whole time. It turns out that the whole resurrection process with the Macan crystal that allowed Mar-Vell to return used a part of the Phoenix Force's power. This led to Captain Mar-Vell possessing a chunk of the Phoenix Force's essence. It's a whole self-fulfilling prophecy wherein Mr. Mar-Vell and the Kree Empire believed the Phoenix would attack them, but it was the same act to prevent this that ultimately led the Phoenix Force to come to their doorstep. Thankfully, Mar-Vell was still the same hero he had always been. Instead of allowing the Kree's home planet, Hala, to be ravaged by the Phoenix Force, Mar-Vell willingly gave himself to it. As a result, he passed on again, but in turn, he saved his own race from peril. Plus, if this didn't clear his name, we don't know what will. Shortly after that, we discover that Mar-Vell's lifeless body ended up on the surface of an unnamed desolate planet. However, his previous contact with the Phoenix Force left some residual energy in his remains. This then caused a plant to sprout out from it and turn the otherwise dead planet into a habitable one. This planet would then be hailed as New Hala and undoubtedly prove that Mar-Vell's legacy lives on.